be continuing the theme from the previous lecture, which has to do with reflecting on communication with singular terms and using claims about communication to draw conclusions about the meaning of singular terms. So in this video, I will give you an overview of the lecture, and I will discuss what Heck calls the problem of content, which arose at the end of the reading for last lecture. So, as we saw in the previous lecture, Heck argues against direct reference theory on the basis of considerations about communication. But, and what I didn't explore in last lecture, is that Heck goes on to argue that these considerations, while they argue against direct reference theory, these considerations do not in fact support the alternative Fregean view. So in this lecture, we will see how Heck argues that the considerations about communication do not in fact support the simple Fregean view. And then we will look at a response to Heck by Dickey and Rattan. So in the rest of this video, let me get on the table the idea, what Heck calls the problem of content. Okay, so to appreciate what the problem of content is, let's first review the two conceptions of communication. So these are the two conceptions of communication from Russell and Frege. So you can think of these two conceptions of communication. So I mentioned them in the very first lecture. And furthermore, I reviewed in the previous lecture the relevant passages from Russell and Frege where these two views of communication are found. And these two views, one can see them as two very simplistic or naive views of communication with singular terms. So what did Russell say? What Russell said was that understanding a singular term occurs just in case the interlocutors think of the same object as referent. And it doesn't matter which way the interlocutors are thinking of this referent, as long as the two people are in fact thinking of the same object as referent in whatever ways, whatever that they in fact are, that's fine. There will be successful understanding or successful communication of a singular term, just in case the interlocutors think of the same object as referent. Now, in contrast to that, Frege's conception was that understanding a singular term requires that the interlocutors think of the same object as referent, but furthermore in the same way. So for Frege, it's not enough that the interlocutors think of the same object as referent in whatever way they do. Rather, what is involved in successful communication, according to Frege, is that the interlocutors think of the same object in the same way. Okay, so one can see Russell's and Frege's conceptions of communication as kind of setting at two extremes. So on the one hand, there's Russell, who says that communication requires merely thinking of the same object, and on the other hand, Frege says you have to think of the same object in the same way. And what Heck argues is, in fact, that both of these conceptions of communication are incorrect, and that there is something in between these two extremes which is correct. Okay, so we can think of Russell's and Frege's conceptions of communication as two simple and naive conceptions. And now I'll go over the reasons why Heck thinks that both of these conceptions of communication are incorrect. So we already saw in the previous lecture why it is that Heck argues that Russell's conception of communication is incorrect. And this is on the basis of, for one, intuitions about what's required for understanding in particular cases. And then there was also, as we saw, an argument on the basis of how knowledge transfer and not information transfer is the basic goal of communication. But putting aside that latter argument, here is a kind of case where we can just see intuitively that merely thinking of the same object as referent is not sufficient for successful communication or understanding. And this case thus shows that Russell's conception of communication is incorrect. So to review the case, and this is a play on the case given in Perry's paper, but we're slightly changing it, okay? So again, as a review, in this case, John and Sally are facing a large body of water. So imagine that John and Sally are in a city looking out over a harbor of that city. And imagine that there's a large building in front of John and Sally, which is between them and the harbor. From the left side of the building, a bow of a ship protrudes, and from the right side of the building, a stern of a ship. Now, John and Sally do not realize that the bow and the stern are of the same ship, which is, let's say, the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. So now suppose Sally utters, "That ship is an aircraft carrier," as she's pointing to the bow. Okay, so Sally's demonstrative, the singular term here, that ship, has as its referent the aircraft carrier, this object here, the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Now, we show in this case how Russell's view is wrong by thinking of John interpreting Sally by thinking of this same object, the same ship, but in a different way. So suppose that, as a result of John's predominant focus on the stern before Sally starts speaking, and perhaps the way Sally's demonstration looks to him, perhaps John thinks that Sally is pointing to the stern. So if John accepts what Sally says, John would form the belief he would express with, "That ship pointing to the stern is an aircraft carrier." So just in summary, Sally is thinking of the aircraft carrier as the one whose bow is protruding. So the ship that you see from the left side of the building. And she says, on the basis of thinking of the ship in that way, she says that ship is an aircraft carrier. So she uses the singular term, that ship. And in interpreting her, John thinks of the ship as the one visible to the right of the building by a stern. And because John and Sally do not realize that the bow and the stern are of the same ship, it seems intuitively that, despite that both John and Sally are thinking of the same object, the USS Enterprise, it seems that there is misunderstanding. It seems that John hasn't understood Sally. Okay, so this case shows intuitively that understanding a singular term requires more than simply thinking of the same object as referent. Okay. However, just because we've shown that understanding requires more than thinking of the same object as referent, that by itself, so the falsity of Russell's naive conception, just because Russell's conception is false, it doesn't mean that Frege's conception is true, i.e., that understanding involves thinking of the same object in the same way. And as I'll show you now, Heck suggests that Frege's conception is also false. So here is a passage from Heck's paper entitled Do Demonstratives Have Senses? So this paper elaborates some of the ideas from the required reading for last week, and also the required reading for last class, and also where the required reading for last class focused on proper names. In this paper here, Heck focuses on demonstratives. Okay, but these ideas about how Frege's view of communication is incorrect can also be found in the required reading from last class. But let me just make explicit this passage from his other paper, and because this is a passage that Dickey and Rattan, who I think I'll use say D and R in the rest of this lecture to talk about for convenience, but in any case, D and R focus on this passage here. Okay, so what is the argument in this passage against Frege's view of communication? Let me read it to you. So Heck writes as follows. Suppose someone says, that bottle is half empty. Must I think of the bottle in the very same way as she does if I am to understand her? I think not. If I can perceive the bottle, if I can think of it demonstratively, I may well be in a position to know which bottle is in question. But my perspective on the bottle may be sufficiently different from hers that my thought is, by the usual Fregean criterion, different from the one the speaker was expressing. So let me stop and try to elaborate what is being argued here. So I want you to imagine two people in a living room together. And these two people are standing on either side of a table. Now, on the table is a bottle. We'll say a bottle of wine. Okay? Now, one person, the speaker, points at the bottle and says, that bottle is half empty. Now, so the speaker has used a singular term, in this case, the demonstrative, that bottle. And now we also imagine in this case that there is understanding between the speaker and the hearer. So intuitively, you can both be standing on either side of a table and successfully communicate about an object on the table, in this case, a bottle. So you're able to successfully communicate by pointing at it and saying that bottle. But now, what Heck notes is as follows. Since in this case, the two people, the speaker and the hearer, are standing on either sides of the table, there will necessarily be some difference in the perspective that the speaker and the hearer have on the bottle. Because, for instance, the speaker is seeing it from one side and the hearer is seeing it from the other. So Heck is saying, in this case, we have successful communication about some object as referent by using a singular term. But it seems like the interlocutors are actually thinking of the bottle in different ways, because again, they have different viewpoints on it. And furthermore, Heck suggests these two perspectives on the bottle are different, or count as different senses. Why? Because he says you could imagine in this case that standing on one side of the table, okay, you see the bottle and you think something about it, and then imagine at a later time that you're standing on the other side of the table. Heck says you can rationally doubt whether it's the same bottle. So by Frege's criterion, which we will review in a minute, it seems like because one can rationally doubt whether that bottle is half empty when they're looking at it from one side, and then when they're looking at it from the other side, they can then doubt whether that bottle is half empty when it's being seen on the other side. That is, it can be someone looking at the bottle from one side of the table can rationally doubt whether or not it's the same bottle when they're looking at it from the other side. So by that, because of that, it seems like the two different perspectives on the bottle that the interlocutors have are or constitute different senses, right? Because, as we'll see, what it means in order for two senses to be the same for Frege is that it's impossible to rationally doubt whether it's the same thing. So, in this case, Heck is suggesting it seems like we can have successful communication about an object when the interlocutors attach different senses to that singular term. Okay. And so, what this reflection on this case is supposed to show is that it's not in general true that understanding a singular term requires that the interlocutors think of the referent in the same way. So more is required than that the interlocutors think of the object in any way, but not as much is required as that the interlocutors think of the same object in the same way. So this observation here that both of these naive conceptions or these naive extremes are incorrect, that observation is what generates what Heck calls the problem of content. So what Heck says is, so Heck's problem of content is this: given that we can understand each other's uses of singular terms while having different perspectives on the reference, the problem of content is therefore to explain how much these different perspectives can differ and what the basis is for two perspectives being appropriately related. So to summarize, Heck claims that the Russellian conception of communication is incorrect. So in order for there to be understanding, we have to do more than think of the same object as referent. And Heck further argues that Frege's conception of communication is incorrect, so is not in general required that the interlocutors think of the same object in the same way. So the intermediate alternative, which Heck suggests, is that understanding requires that the interlocutors think of the object in appropriately related ways. So you don't have to think of the object in the same way as the speaker, but you have to think of the object in an appropriately related way. So for instance, thinking of the ship as the one whose bow is sticking out from the left and thinking of the ship as the one whose stern is sticking out from the right are not appropriately related ways. And that's why there is not communication. However, the two different ways of thinking of the bottle while standing on either side of the table are appropriately related. So, given that this seems plausible, this kind of intermediate view in which there is communication just in case the interlocutors attach appropriately related senses, there is then the challenge of explaining what it means for two senses to be appropriately related. And explaining that is precisely what Heck means by the problem of content. Okay, so now before moving to the next video where I'll give the response to this problem or the attempted solution to this problem, from D and R, I'll quickly review how it is that these reflections about communication have consequences for thinking about the nature of meaning. So in this class, we spent a lot of time looking at whether or not the direct reference theory or the Fregean view of meaning is correct. Okay? And given this Fregean principle that meaning explains use, so again, so this principle MU, which is that the meaning of an expression explains what is required to understand it. Okay, and I have a couple of qualifications here. So one is that we have to make sure that we're talking about uses or tokens of expressions, because, for instance, we might be talking about context-sensitive expressions, for instance, demonstratives. Okay. And the second qualification is that there are elements of what's required to understand an expression which do not have to do with the expression's meaning. So, for instance, one has to be a speaker of the relevant language. So you have to have a general competence in a language in order to understand words in it. And also, in order to understand a use of language, you have to hear the utterance properly. So for instance, if you're in a factory and a machine is banging loudly beside you and someone is trying to talk to you, you won't be able to understand what they're saying, but that doesn't have to do with the meaning of their words. That has to do with just external considerations about hearing the utterance properly. So putting aside those external things, the Fregean principle, which we've seen come up in using Frege's puzzles to argue against direct reference theory. Okay, the Fregean principle is that the meaning of an expression explains what is required to understand it, and more generally, the principle has been that the meaning of an expression explains its cognitive value. Okay, and so here we are thinking of understanding as a kind of cognitive value. So given MU, we can lay out these three different views of meaning and think about what they entail or predict about what's required for understanding. So the direct reference theory says that the meaning of a singular term is justus referent. So given MU, understanding according to this view only involves thinking of the referent in some way, and that again is Russell's view. So Russell's conception of communication, given MU, is entailed by the direct reference theory. And that is how Heck argues against the direct reference theory by arguing against Russell's conception of communication. Now, the alternative, the simple alternative, the simple Fregean alternative, is that the meaning of a singular term is a sense, or a way of thinking of a referent. Now, given MU, what that means is that understanding involves the interlocutors thinking of the referent in the same way. So what that means is that the simple Fregean view of meaning, given MU, entails Frege's conception of communication. And so given that Heck argues that Frege's conception of communication is also incorrect, he also gives an argument against simple Fregeanism. Now, the alternative which Heck proposes is that the meaning of a singular term it involves a collection of senses, not a single sense. And this we can call moderate Fregeanism. And given MU, according to moderate Fregeanism, understanding involves thinking of the referent under one of the collected senses. So this collection of senses will be a collection of appropriately related ones. So now in the next video, we'll see how Dickey and Rattan, or D and R, argue against the moderate Fregean view and try to save something like the simple Fregean view in response to Heck's problem of content.